She said it as casually as if she were signing a contract. "Grant is coming to pick me up. I will be staying at his penthouse tonight." Ethan Cole froze in the middle of the living room, the glass of water slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. The sharp sound echoed through the house, but it was nothing compared to what exploded inside his chest. The quiet suburban home in Bellevue, the place he had always believed was the safest ground in his life, suddenly felt like a battlefield. That morning had started like every other morning. Precise, almost cold in its discipline. At 5:10 in the morning, Ethan woke up without an alarm. Military habits never truly leave you no matter how many years you have been out. He worked out in the garage, sweat dripping steadily onto the concrete floor. He ate a simple breakfast, checked his schedule. Everything moved smoothly, exactly on rhythm. Yet deep inside, something felt off, like metal scraping against metal, just before a trigger is pulled. He felt uneasy without knowing why. In combat zones, that instinct had saved his life more than once. In marriage, he had learned to ignore it. Ethan believed he had built a good life, a stable marriage, a solid job in corporate security, 3 healthy children, a house big enough to hold laughter and quiet enough to protect dreams. Maya, his wife, had once been the person he trusted more than anyone. 8 years of marriage, years of struggling together, sleepless nights with sick children, small hopes that somehow warmed an entire future. Then the cracks began to show. Maya had been dressing differently. Tighter dresses, unfamiliar perfume. Her phone buzzed more often, and she smiled at it before turning the screen face down, as if hiding something fragile. Their closeness faded. When Ethan asked, she talked about career opportunities, pressure at work, a demanding but powerful boss named Grant Holloway. Ethan had met Grant a few times. A polished man with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed, his eyes sliding past Ethan as if he were nothing more than background furniture. Ethan never realized he was being distracted. That afternoon, the kids went to stay with their Aunt Sienna. Ethan felt hopeful. He thought this was their chance to reconnect, to mend what had started to tear. When he walked into the house, Maya was standing in front of the mirror, wearing a red dress, her hair neatly styled, her lipstick perfectly applied. She looked beautiful, but unfamiliar. Ethan joked that if he had known they had plans, he would have come home earlier. Maya did not smile. She turned to him, her expression calm and unsettlingly cold, and she said it. No apology, no hesitation, no explanation. She continued in an even voice, laying out terms as if this were a business arrangement. From now on, things would be different. She would remain his wife. She would still live there, but she needed more. Grant gave her that. Power, money, opportunity. If Ethan made this difficult, the consequences would be bad. Very bad. For his job, for his life, and especially for his right to be a father. Ethan felt the blood rush to his ears, but he did not shout. He did not break anything. His combat training took over. When you are ambushed, the first move is not to attack. It is to find cover. He walked upstairs quietly, each step heavier than the last. In the bedroom, he closed the door and took a deep breath. 3 rules surfaced clearly in his mind. Stay alert. Find cover. Make a plan fast. He had failed the first rule. The other 2 were still within reach. Ethan changed into casual clothes. He took his phone, set it to record, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. His hands were steady. Before leaving the room, he paused and looked at himself in the mirror. He looked ordinary. A husband, a father. No one would guess he had once led teams through pitch-black nights, making life or death decisions in seconds. Downstairs, Maya was already seated, pouring herself a glass of wine. The doorbell was about to ring. Ethan stepped off the last stair, his mind no longer chaotic, but cold and clear. If this was an ambush, he would not die quietly. Ethan had survived situations most people could never imagine, but he never believed the most brutal blow would come from inside his own home. Before everything collapsed, he truly believed his life was finally in the right place. Not perfect, but solid. An 8-year marriage, 3 children who were the center of his world, a stable career in corporate security, and a quiet house in the suburbs where neighbors greeted each other every morning. Ethan never wanted luxury. He wanted order, safety, and honesty. For a long time, he thought he had all of that. Ethan Cole was not a man who wore his emotions openly. Years in the military had taught him how to lock away, fear, suppress pain, and keep moving forward. After leaving the service, he transitioned into internal security for a large logistics corporation. The title sounded ordinary, almost forgettable, but the work was anything but. Ethan was the person they called when there were signs of information leaks, internal threats, or risks that needed to be neutralized before they exploded. He was used to being underestimated. Plain shirts, quiet demeanor, few words. No one ever guessed how much authority he actually carried. Maya had once been the only person who understood that, or at least Ethan believed she did. They met when neither of them had anything. Maya was sharp, ambitious, always looking beyond the present. Ethan became her silent foundation, the man who stood behind her so she could move forward. When Maya entered the corporate world, Ethan stepped back, not out of weakness, but out of trust. One of them would push ahead, the other would hold the line. That balance began to tilt the moment Grant Holloway entered their lives. Grant was not like the other men Maya had mentioned before. He carried power without needing to flaunt it. His voice was low-controlled, his eyes always calculating. At the rare company events Ethan attended, Grant shook his hand without warmth, his gaze sliding past him, as if Ethan were nothing more than an accessory to Maya. And for the first time, Maya did not push back. Late dinners became frequent. Sudden business trips. Phone calls that ended abruptly the moment Ethan entered the room. The house still echoed with the children's laughter, but between the two adults the air grew thinner, as if oxygen was slowly being drained without anyone noticing. Ethan saw the changes, but he chose to trust. He trusted that work pressure was real. He trusted that marriages were not always warm. He trusted that patience would eventually restore what had shifted. That choice became his greatest mistake. What Maya never knew was that in recent months, Ethan had noticed Grant Holloway's name appearing in places it did not belong. Questionable vendor contracts, shell companies with strange structures, money moving in circles deliberately obscured. Ethan documented it quietly out of habit, more than suspicion. He had not investigated further. He had not acted. But his instincts were already warning him, even if he had not yet connected them to his own marriage. So when Maya stood there in that red dress and calmly announced she would be spending the night with Grant, Ethan did not just hear betrayal. He heard metal grinding against metal. He heard a trap closing. In Maya's mind, everything was already settled. Grant was the future. Grant was protection. Grant was the man who could crush anyone who stood in his way. Ethan, to her, had become a good man who no longer fit, a piece of the past that needed to be set aside so she could move forward. She had no idea that the man standing silently in front of her had once led operations where a single mistake meant death. She had no idea he was accustomed to being surrounded, threatened, and still walking away, alive. When Ethan went upstairs, Maya believed she had control. She assumed he needed time to accept reality. She believed the power rested with her and Grant. She was wrong. Inside the quiet bedroom, Ethan felt no fear, only cold focus. The pieces began to lock into place. Grant, the contracts, the threats, the confidence bordering on arrogance, and Maya standing between worlds, convinced she understood the rules of the game. When Ethan opened the bedroom door and walked back down the stairs, He carried a plan that had already begun to form. He was no longer a betrayed husband trying to comprehend what had happened. He was stepping into a confrontation his enemies did not realize he had been preparing for all along. ChatGPT ko the macloi. Hei kiem trakach thong tin quan trong. Vui long tam kau tui chon kuki. The doorbell rang once sharp and deliberate, like the opening strike of a verdict that had already been written. Maya stood up before the sound had even faded. She smoothed her dress, took a steady breath, and opened the door with the familiar smile Ethan once believed was meant only for him. Grant Holloway stood there tall and composed, wearing a dark overcoat. Beside him was Victor Dane, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, his cold eyes already measuring every possible exit inside the house. Grant stepped in, the way an owner returns to his property. His gaze swept across the living room, assessing the space, then settled on Ethan. There was no surprise, no caution, only confirmation, as if everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Ethan remained still, shoulders relaxed, arms at his sides. To anyone watching, he looked like a man who had already accepted defeat. Grant believed that too. "We need to talk," Grant said, his voice low, and even carrying the authority forged in closed boardrooms and quiet backroom deals. Adults need to talk. Ethan glanced at Maya. There was tension in her eyes, but also something else: expectation. She believed Grant would handle this. She believed power would do the rest. Grant sat down without waiting to be invited. Victor positioned himself near the door, arms crossed. The setup was perfect. 3 against 1. Maya spoke first, as if chairing a meeting. "I already told you. Grant and I have agreed. Everything will be simple if you cooperate." "Cooperate," Ethan repeated softly. "Cooperate how?" Grant smiled, not warmly, but with the confidence of a man used to giving orders and being obeyed. "We do not want things to get ugly. She remains your wife. The family stays intact on paper, but she will spend time with me when needed. Business trips, events. Sometimes here, when you are away." Maya nodded, confirming each term. Ethan felt his heartbeat slow, his mind sharpened to a frightening clarity. This was no longer betrayal. This was possession. "And if I do not agree?" Ethan asked, his eyes never leaving Grant. Grant tilted his head, as if the question were naive. "Then I am afraid everything you have will disappear. Your job, this house, and your right to your children. I have connections that are very useful. People who dislike complications." Maya avoided Ethan's gaze. For a brief moment, something twisted in her chest, but she crushed it quickly. She told herself this was the cost of ambition, that everything would settle in time. Ethan nodded slowly. Grant took it as surrender. Victor relaxed his stance, as if the danger had passed. That was when Ethan spoke again, calmly, chillingly. "Then let me tell you this." He took a single step forward, unhurried. Grant looked up, irritation flickering as his control was interrupted. "Who do you think I am?" Ethan said. "A harmless husband afraid of losing his job, his house, his kids. A man who bows because you speak louder." Grant did not answer. He only watched. "I work in internal security." Ethan continued, his voice steady, every word precisely placed. "Not the kind that stands at gates. I am the one they call when money moves the wrong way, when contracts smell wrong, when a name appears too often where it should not." Maya snapped her head up. Grant narrowed his eyes. "Over the past few months," Ethan went on, "I have seen your name tied to some very interesting intermediary companies. Strange structures, circular money flows, vendors paid through layers. I have not said anything. I have not touched it. But I remember it very clearly." Grant let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Are you threatening me?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I am explaining why you chose the wrong house to walk into." The air in the room thickened. Victor shifted his feet, his hand tightening instinctively. Ethan turned to Maya. She was trembling now, struggling to stay composed. For the first time, she sensed something slipping beyond her control. The man she thought had been cornered was speaking with the calm authority of someone holding the board. "I do not need your permission to divorce," Ethan said, turning back to Grant. "And if you think these threats will silence me, then you have underestimated me more than anyone else ever has." Grant stood up. The smile vanished. Victor stepped forward half a pace. Ethan straightened as well. He was not as tall as Victor. He did not wear a suit like Grant. But there was something both men felt in that moment, unmistakable and dangerous. "This is the last time you speak in my house," Ethan said, his voice low and final. "And the last time you believe you control me." Outside, the streetlights cast a soft yellow glow through the windows. A quiet neighborhood. No one knew that inside this house, the line between predator and prey had just been reversed. Maya was the first to break the silence, but her voice was no longer steady. "You have no idea who you are dealing with, Ethan. Grant is not like the men you are used to. He can make things disappear with a single phone call." Ethan did not answer right away. He looked around the living room, a space that once held quiet evenings, children's laughter, familiar smells. Now every corner felt invaded. He felt the anger rising, but it did not explode. It compressed cold and sharp. He turned to Grant, his gaze calm in a way that made the other man uneasy. "You are right about one thing," Ethan said slowly. "I do not understand you the way you want me to, but I understand power, and I understand fear." Grant smirked. Victor stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the carpet like a silent warning. Ethan continued, his voice no louder, but every word landed with weight. "You think I am afraid of losing my job, afraid of losing this house, afraid of losing my children? But you missed one very important detail." Maya held her breath. "I do not stay silent to survive," Ethan said. "I stay silent because I choose to." Grant froze for a brief moment, not because of a threat, but because of the tone. The voice of someone used to controlling information, not begging for mercy. Ethan walked toward the dining table, where a thin folder had already been placed before Grant arrived. He picked it up, flipped through a few pages, then set it down in front of Maya. "Divorce papers," he said. "Fault-based, infidelity, coercion, threats." Maya's face drained of color. She had not expected things to move this fast. In her mind, this was supposed to drag on to involve negotiations, exhaustion, a slow surrender. Ethan had not hesitated at all. Grant let out a short laugh. "Paper means nothing. You think a form can save you." Ethan looked straight at him. "No, but it is the beginning." He turned slightly, his voice gaining a different rhythm. "Do you remember the company gala next week? The fundraising event where you will speak in front of board members, investors, and the press?" Grant narrowed his eyes. Maya spun toward Ethan. "I have the guest list," Ethan continued, "and I have the ability to make certain stories surface at exactly the right time. Not rumors, not speculation. Just very simple questions about contracts, vendors, and money that wandered off its path." The air in the room hardened. Victor glanced at Grant, searching for direction for the first time. "You like power because it works best in the dark," Ethan said. "But stage lights are different. They do not forgive mistakes, and they do not care who you know." Grant stood abruptly. "Enough." His voice was tight. "You are playing a very dangerous game." Ethan nodded. "I know, but I am not playing it alone." Maya stepped back. In her eyes, the image of the quiet, manageable husband collapsed completely. Standing before her was someone sharp, cold, and immovable. A terrifying truth settled in. The power she thought she held had never really belonged to her. Grant moved closer to Ethan, his voice low and poisonous. "If you go down this road, I will not stop. You will lose everything. Your career will disappear. No one hires trouble." Ethan met his stare. "I prepared for that, and I am ready." In that moment, Grant understood that ordinary threats no longer worked. He was facing a man with nothing left to lose, And worse, a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Maya broke down, her sobs catching in her throat. Ethan looked at her one last time. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a deep regret for a family that no longer existed. "I was willing to die for this family," Ethan said, his voice dropping, "but I will not live on my knees for it." He turned and walked toward the stairs. Behind him, Grant stood frozen, Victor tense, and Maya collapsed into a chair, finally realizing the board had shifted. Outside, the night remained quiet, but inside that house, a decision had been made, and there was no going back to the beginning. The punch landed before anyone could say another word. Victor surged forward like a block of steel dropped from a crane, his fist cutting a brutal straight line toward Ethan's head. The impact cracked through the room, blood flooding Ethan's mouth as the world tilted for a heartbeat, but he did not fall. He shifted half a step back, his foot sliding across the carpet, his body turning with the force. Years of training snapped awake like a dormant reflex. When violence begins, thinking stops, and instinct takes over. Maya screamed. Grant barked a sharp command. Victor pressed the attack fast, and heavy blow after blow. Ethan raised his arms to block pain, shooting through them with every hit. Victor's strikes carried the confidence of a man used to winning in closed rooms where no one dared fight back. Ethan absorbed the blows to read the rhythm 1, 2, 3, measuring breath-shoulder rotation, the gap between punches. Then he moved. He stepped inside the range, his elbow snapping up tight and precise. Victor stalled for a split second. Ethan rotated his hips and used gravity to pull him off balance. Their bodies crashed into the table, and chairs, glasses spilling shards of glass exploding underfoot. Grant backed away, his anger shifting into caution. He had not expected the man he dismissed as harmless to move like this. No showmanship, no wasted motion, only efficiency. Victor roared and swung again. Ethan slid aside, caught the wrist, twisted it down hard. Pain tore a curse from Victor's throat, but he did not quit. With his free hand, he reached inside his jacket. Ethan saw the movement, and his heart tightened for an instant. A weapon. He lunged, driving his shoulder into Victor's chest and throwing him back onto the couch. A metal object fell and skittered across the floor with a cold clatter. Ethan kicked it away and dropped his weight to pin Victor's arm. The air went thick. Maya stood, frozen hands over her mouth. Grant stared, finally realizing the game was slipping beyond his control. Ethan breathed hard, pain radiating from his temple down his neck, each breath cutting into his lungs, but his mind stayed clear. He leaned close to Victor's face and spoke low and deliberate. "Stop, now." Victor did not answer. The ferocity in his eyes wavered, confusion breaking through for the first time. A sound behind them made Ethan turn just in time to see Grant lifting a long metal poker from the fireplace, both hands raised. No more disguise, no more words, only intent. Maya cried out. Ethan released Victor and spun, bringing his arm up to block. The metal slammed down, numbing his arm so badly it felt shattered, the crack echoing through the house. Ethan staggered, but did not retreat. He rushed in both hands, fighting for the weapon. Grant was not built for close combat, stronger with threats than with force. The poker slipped from his grip and hit the carpet. In that chaos, Ethan spotted the phone in Grant's coat pocket, and a thought flashed through him like lightning. He grabbed the phone and lit the screen. Grant panicked and shouted for it back. Ethan held it level with his eyes and said, "Call your wife right now." Grant froze, sweat breaking across his forehead. Maya stared at him, then at Ethan, fear and disbelief colliding in her eyes. "Call her, Ethan," repeated, his voice calm and absolute. Grant's hand shook as he tapped the screen. The call connected, and a woman's face appeared, confused, unaware of the disaster unfolding. Ethan turned the phone so the camera captured the room, Grant on the floor. Victor gasping, Maya rigid with shock. "You should tell the truth," Ethan said slowly, "before this gets worse." Grant opened his mouth, but no words came. On the other end, the woman's confusion turned to alarm, as questions spilled from the speaker. Grant lunged, trying to snatch the phone. Ethan dodged and stepped back, heart pounding, setting the phone down with the screen still lit and recording. Then he turned to the laptop Grant had brought and set on the table. The pieces clicked together in his mind, the threats, the dirty files, the tools meant to crush other people. He grabbed a heavy object and smashed it down on the screen. Plastic cracked glass splintered. Again and again, until the laptop lay silent, a dead heap of shattered parts. The house fell into a stunned quiet, broken only by ragged breathing and the thud of Ethan's heart. He stood in the wrecked living room, blood at his temple, his arms screaming with pain, and looked around at what remained of his family, his enemies, and the truth laid bare. Outside, the streetlights still cast their calm yellow glow. Inside, there was no turning back. What had happened could not be undone, and Ethan knew that from this moment on, everything would escalate. He did not seek violence, but when it came for him, he was ready to answer. The sound of police sirens tore through the night, before Ethan even realized the blood had soaked into his collar. That sound did not bring relief, it brought reversal. In a single chilling instant, Ethan understood that the fight inside his house was not over. It had simply changed its face. Neighbors gathered outside shadows, flickering behind curtains. Red and blue lights swept across the wrecked living room, reflecting off shattered glass and spilled wine. Ethan stood upright, forcing himself to stay balanced, his arm numb, his head screaming, but his mind clear. Grant sat on the floor, gasping, his face drained of color. Victor lay slumped on the couch, clutching his arm, eyes unfocused. Maya stood against the wall, shaking, tears streaming, every plan she believed in now, in ruins. Police officers poured in, voices, sharp commands, rapid hands up, get down. No one asked how it began, only what remained, and the scene told a dangerous story. Ethan complied, slowly dropping to his knees, hands on his head, thinking of his children, Noah, Ava, Mia, wondering who would pick them up the next morning, who would explain why their father was not coming home. The cuffs closed around his wrists with a cold metallic click, painfully familiar. He had seen them on others during distant operations, never imagining they would lock around him in his own home. Maya stepped forward, her voice breaking, saying she never wanted this. She never thought it would go this far. Ethan did not look at her. He stared into the glare of police lights, anger gone, replaced by a heavy emptiness. Grant was helped to his feet and began to speak, fast, clear, disturbingly calm, telling a story of a man who lost control, of rage, of unprovoked violence, a story he had rehearsed long before this night. Victor nodded once, a small motion that sealed the lie. Maya looked at Ethan, then at the officers, hesitated for a heartbeat, then turned away. That was the real twist of the night. Not the violence, not the betrayal, but this realization. Ethan was not just attacked, he was being framed. He was taken to the ambulance first because of his injuries. Inside, the smell of antiseptic mixed with metal. His pulse thundered in his ears. A medic asked if he was in pain, and he nodded, knowing the physical pain was nothing compared to the suffocating weight of betrayal layered upon betrayal. In the hospital, white light stripped everything of warmth, bandages wrapped his head, his arm was secured, monitors beeped steadily. He closed his eyes, but sleep would not come. Images looping endlessly, the punch, Maya's eyes, Grant's cold smile. 3 days passed in a haze of medication. When Ethan finally woke fully, the first thing he saw was not a doctor, but a man in a suit standing beside his bed eyes. Sharp voice, flat telling him he was being detained for investigation on serious charges. The accusations were read aloud: intentional assault, use of a deadly weapon, endangerment of life, domestic abuse. Ethan let out a dry, hollow laugh. Domestic abuse. The words echoed like a curse. His wrist was cuffed to the hospital bed again this time, not because of war, but because of a story written by someone else. Maya had testified. Grant had testified. Victor had testified. 3 accounts aligned, perfectly polished and prepared. Ethan was the unstable aggressor, the violent threat. When the investigator left the room, fell silent. Ethan stared at the ceiling, and that familiar sensation returned: not fear, but cold focus. They believed he was finished. They believed he was just a broken husband at the end of his road. They did not know that in the phone taken from his pocket was more truth than they ever expected. Ethan drew a slow breath. This was not the end. This was the beginning of a different war, not with fists or metal, but with truth. And truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way back to the surface. The public defender showed up on the 5th day, carrying a thin folder and the look of someone who had already seen cases like this collapse before they truly began. He sat beside Ethan's hospital bed, glanced at the cast on Ethan's arm, the cuff secured to the frame, and let out a quiet sigh. His voice was flat, worn by repetition. The situation is bad. 3 witnesses are telling the same story. The prosecution wants to hold you. If you take a deal, the sentence could be reduced. Ethan looked at him without speaking. In his mind, memories were rearranging themselves, not like a man cornered, but like an officer mapping a new battlefield. "I am not pleading guilty," Ethan said. His voice was rough but steady. "I was set up." The defender frowned slightly. He heard that every day. Everyone claimed innocence. Then Ethan continued slowly, with weight behind every word. "My phone recorded everything. The confrontation. The threats. Even the moment I was attacked first." The defender stopped writing. His expression shifted. He leaned forward. "Where is the phone?" "It was confiscated," Ethan answered. "But it exists. And I know where it is." The defender went quiet for several seconds, then stood. "I will make a note of that. But you need to prepare yourself. The people you are up against are not ordinary." Ethan nodded. He did not need the warning. That afternoon, a nurse came in and said a family member was asking to see him. When the door opened, Ethan saw Marcus Cole, his uncle. The man who taught him to shoot when he was 13. The man who once wore a Navy uniform and later walked out of courtrooms while powerful men lowered their heads. Marcus stood there, gray-haired eyes, sharp as a blade. He did not ask how Ethan felt. He did not offer comfort. He simply studied him for a long moment, then gave a short nod. "You are still alive," Marcus said. "That is good." Something loosened in Ethan's chest for the first time since that night. They spoke quietly and quickly, like men accustomed to danger. Ethan told him everything without embellishment or omission. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Ethan mentioned Grant, the shadow contracts, the intermediary companies, Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Do you remember the names of those companies?" Ethan recited them slowly and precisely. Marcus wrote them down, then smiled faintly, the smile of a man who had just heard what he was waiting for. "Then this is not just a domestic violence case. This is something else. Something bigger." Over the following days, Marcus moved like a ghost. Phone calls, messages, meetings with people Ethan had never met. A private investigator appeared in the hospital room and introduced himself with a brief handshake. They asked Ethan about his past work, his access to the reports he had once touched. Ethan answered everything. For the first time, he did not stay silent. One evening, Dan Ruiz, an old neighbor, came by looking tense. He spoke quietly, as if the walls might listen. "There were strangers around your house, wearing black, snooping in the garage. I chased them off. They drove a black sports car with the plates covered. Marcus looked at Dan, then at Ethan. He did not ask more questions. He simply nodded, exactly as expected. Maya meanwhile began to panic. She called Marcus, her voice shaking, asking if there was a way to resolve this quietly. Grant was different. He went silent. Too silent. To Marcus, that was the clearest sign of all. When powerful people stop threatening, it means they are trying to erase evidence. Marcus arranged a meeting not with police, not with prosecutors, but with people who worked in the shadows of the financial system, people who understood what money revealed when people lied. In a rented room, Ethan watched complex diagrams glow on a screen. Arrows, circles. Grant's name at the center linked to shell companies, vendor contracts payments that looped and returned. Ethan recognized what he had long suspected, but now it was no longer intuition. It was proof. Marcus placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You are not just saving yourself. You are touching a monster." Ethan stared at the screen, blue light washing over his exhausted but resolute face. He thought of his children, of the home that was gone, of the price of silence. "Then let us end it," Ethan said. "Not just for me, for everyone he crushed before." Marcus smiled. That was the answer he had been waiting for. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. But in the dark, a different war had officially begun. This was no longer the story of a betrayed husband. It was a confrontation between truth and borrowed power. And this time, Ethan was no longer alone. The hearing began with a silence so heavy, Ethan could hear his own heartbeat. The courtroom was cold, and bright wooden benches, aligned in rigid rows, curious eyes fixed on the man in a simple shirt, seated at the defense table. There were no handcuffs, no hospital gown, but the injuries on his face were still visible, undeniable marks of the night that changed everything. Grant sat across from him, back straight suit, immaculate, the calm expression of a man who believed he still controlled the game. Maya sat beside him, hands clasped tightly, lips pressed together. Victor was absent, his attorney stating he was receiving medical treatment. The prosecutor rose first, voice steady and confident, retelling the story, once more, a jealous husband, uncontrolled rage, a violent attack, a dangerous man who needed to be stopped. Ethan listened without reaction. Marcus sat behind him, sharp-eyed and composed, watching the judge instead of the prosecutor. When it was time for the defense, the public defender spoke only briefly, asking the court to consider new evidence. Grant smirked slightly. Maya's breathing quickened. They believed it was a desperate move. Then Marcus stood. He gave no long introduction, only his name and his role as new counsel for the defendant. His voice was low and clear, and the room fell silent on its own. He requested permission to present a video recording that captured the entire incident inside the house that night. The prosecutor immediately objected, arguing the evidence had not been reviewed or verified, and could have been altered. Marcus nodded, agreeing calmly, and explained that was precisely why they were asking for it to be played here in open court, before those who had sworn to tell the truth. The judge studied Marcus, then the prosecution, and finally gave a slow nod. The courtroom lights dimmed, and the screen came alive. The footage was shaky, filmed from a low angle. Ethan's voice came first, calm warning. Then Grant's voice followed, cold and threatening, boasting about power, about destroying a life with a single call. Maya began to tremble in the gallery. Grant sat rigid, eyes wide, his face betraying him. The video continued, Victor lunging the punch, the chaos glass shattering Ethan's final warning, and then the moment that could not be denied, Victor reaching for a weapon. A murmur rippled through the room. The prosecutor looked down at his notes. The judge leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen. The video ended in absolute silence. Marcus rose again and stated that this was not all, that they also had audio from the phone call that same night, and a later confession from one of the involved parties recorded legally. Grant sprang to his feet, shouting that it was impossible, that it was fabricated. Marcus turned to him and pointed out that Grant had claimed he did not remember how the night unfolded yet. On the video, he spoke clearly about his connections to police prosecutors and the system itself, and asked if he wished to explain that. Grant opened his mouth, but no words came. Maya broke down, crying not a plea for mercy, but the sob of someone realizing she had chosen the wrong side and that the cost was far greater than she imagined. The judge struck the gavel and called for order. After a brief recess, the ruling was delivered. All charges against Ethan were temporarily suspended, pending further investigation. Bail was granted, and the court ordered an expanded inquiry into threats assault and possible false testimony. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, not in relief, but in understanding that this was only the first door opening. Grant was ordered to remain. Maya bowed her head, shoulders shaking. Marcus placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, offering no smile, only a nod. Outside, afternoon sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps. Ethan stepped into it and took a deep breath. For the first time in days, air filled his lungs without fear. He knew the road ahead was long, but the truth had spoken, and once the truth is heard, those who live in darkness lose their shelter. He looked up at the sky and thought of his children. He had not fallen, not because he was stronger than them, but because he refused to stay silent. And this time, silence would never be an option again. The news exploded the next morning like a bomb that needed no fuse. Grant was summoned for an emergency review, not because of Ethan, but because of money, because of the streams of cash he believed were buried safely beneath layers of lifeless contracts. Before the sun climbed high, departments began to shake. Phones rang without pause, office doors stayed shut, and faces that once carried arrogance now drained of color, in silence. Ethan knew it before Marcus called. He was standing in the small kitchen of a short-term rental, making coffee for himself, his hands still trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a body that had not yet forgotten the days spent cuffed to a hospital bed. "They have opened a formal financial investigation," Marcus said over the phone. "There is no way back for Grant now." Ethan closed his eyes. Part of him felt lighter. Another part grew heavier, because he understood that when truth starts to surface, those who lived in darkness fight the hardest. Maya was the first to collapse. She was called in for questioning alone, without Grant, without a lawyer whispering cues into her ear. In a white room, every word she spoke sounded brutally clear. The emails, the messages, the instructions to remember the script correctly. Each answer pulled her further away from the illusion that she was merely swept along. She cried, no acting, no calculation. For the first time, Maya truly faced the reality that she had not only betrayed a husband, she had betrayed herself. Victor did not stay silent for long. His injury kept him in the hospital, but fear was what truly kept him awake. When investigators placed recordings and images in front of him, he realized loyalty to Grant was no longer worth the cost. A reduced charge, a deal. Victor chose survival. He talked every detail: who gave the orders, who paid the money, who told him to bring a weapon. Each statement landed like another blade against a wall already cracked. Grant was left alone. He tried to maintain his posture, his suit, his commanding voice, but calls were no longer returned as quickly. Names that once bowed now avoided his eyes. His power, it turned out, only existed when no one dared to look too closely. Ethan watched everything from a distance. He did not appear in the news. He gave no interviews. He spent his time with his children during the short afternoons he was allowed to see them. Noah clung to him and asked why his father was not coming home. Ethan told him he was fixing something very important. Ava and Mia drew pictures: a house, 3 figures standing at the door. Ethan stared at the drawing for a long time and said nothing. Marcus pushed the case higher. It was no longer about self-defense or violence. It was about structure, a network, a system that had operated for years, crushing those without a voice. When the arrest warrant was finally issued, Grant had no time to prepare. He stood in his office as two unfamiliar men presented the documents. There was no smile left, no threats, only the emptiness of a man realizing everything he built rested on sand. Ethan was not there when Grant was handcuffed. He did not need to be. He had known that moment was coming for a long time. The next court proceedings were no longer a fight for Ethan's survival. They became an exposure. Numbers were read aloud. Contracts were projected. The boasts once spoken in private returned as undeniable evidence. Maya was sentenced not harshly, but enough to teach her that every choice has a price. Victor, as well. Grant, the man who believed he stood above everyone, received a longer sentence than any of them. When it was over, Ethan stood alone on the balcony of his small apartment. The city stretched out below, unchanged, but he was not the same. He had not won because he was stronger. He had won because he refused to bow, refused to let others write his story. Marcus stood beside him in silence as the wind moved gently. One chapter had closed, but the road ahead was still long. Ethan thought of his children, of those who had been threatened without anyone standing up for them. He understood that responsibility does not end with a verdict. Truth had won a battle, but for it to truly matter, someone had to keep it alive. Ethan drew a deep breath, not to prepare for another fight, but to begin rebuilding. That morning, Ethan received a call from the court. The clerk's voice, calm and almost cold, but the message carried real weight. Temporary custody of the children was granted to him. Ethan stood motionless in the small living room, the phone pressed to his ear, his heart pounding so hard he had to brace himself against the wall to stay steady. He did not say, "Thank you." He said nothing at all. When the call ended, silence filled the room, and in that silence, Ethan bent forward, covering his face with both hands, his breath shaking not because of victory, but because after all the chaos, he was finally allowed to do the one thing he had always wanted to be with his children. Marcus arrived that afternoon with a stack of documents and an old bottle of wine. He did not say much. He simply set the bottle on the table and nodded at Ethan. "We still have work to do," he said. Ethan understood immediately. Grant's case was over, but what he left behind was not. Shell companies, shady contracts, people who had been threatened, silenced, forced to keep quiet. That system would not collapse just because of one verdict. But Ethan was no longer standing on the sidelines. He began appearing in closed meetings, not as a victim, but as someone who understood the internal structure. The questions he asked made entire rooms fall silent, not because he raised his voice, but because he knew exactly what he was asking. Some looked at him with suspicion. A man once handcuffed, once accused of violence, now sitting at the head of the table, talking about accountability and transparency. Then the files were opened, the data cross-checked, and one by one, the doubts faded. Ethan did not need a title. He did not need a position. His power came from somewhere else, from the truth, and from the fact that he had nothing left to lose except his children. Maya appeared once during a brief discussion about visitation. She had grown thinner, her eyes no longer sharp as before. When she looked at Ethan, there was no challenge left in them, only exhaustion and a regret that could not be undone. "I am sorry," Maya said, not to justify herself, just to say it. Ethan nodded. He did not forgive her, but he did not seek revenge either. Some distances exist without needing words. In the first days after bringing the children to the new apartment, there was not much furniture, only unfamiliar laughter echoing through the empty space. Noah chose a corner to place his books. Ava and Mia argued playfully over the couch. Ethan stood watching, his chest heavy. He could not make up for everything, but he could begin again. At night, after the children were asleep, Ethan sat alone by the window, looking out at the city lights. He thought about the people who had no one to stand up for them, those who lost their jobs, their homes, their families to power games, just like the one that almost took everything from him. An idea began to form, vague at first, then clearer. Ethan started reaching out to those people, not as a hero, but as someone who had walked the same road. He listened, took notes, connected them with independent lawyers and journalists who still had a conscience. Marcus watched him work sometimes, standing silently in the corner of the room. "You are putting yourself back into another storm," he said once. Ethan answered simply, "I know, but this time I am not staying silent." News of a new whistleblower group began to spread, not loudly, but steadily. Small file stories that seemed insignificant on their own, but when placed together, they revealed a disturbing picture of how power had been abused in silence for years. Ethan never appeared in front of cameras. He let the truth speak for itself. It was a lesson he learned too late, but not too late to matter. One evening, Noah asked him, "Dad, are you scared?" Ethan knelt to his son's level. "I was very scared once," he said, "but I am more afraid of doing nothing." Noah nodded, not fully understanding. Ava and Mia ran over and wrapped their arms around him, laughing, and in that moment, all the exhaustion faded. Ethan looked at his children, then at the city beyond the window. He was no longer the underestimated man in the old house. He was a father, a witness, and someone who no longer accepted the dark. This fight did not bring fame. It did not bring instant peace, but it brought something more important, meaning. And Ethan knew that from now on, every step he took would no longer be just for himself. The sentence was delivered on a rainy afternoon, and a single short line was enough to close everything Grant once believed was untouchable. Grant was sentenced to federal prison. There was no cheering, no loud satisfaction. Inside the courtroom, there was only the sound of a pen tapping against the desk and the heavy breathing of people who had just witnessed an empire collapse. Grant stood there, shoulders slumped, his face drained of color, as if he had aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. The man who once walked into Ethan's home with absolute arrogance now no longer controlled even his own steps. Ethan sat silently. He did not look at Grant when the handcuffs closed. He looked toward the tall courtroom window, where pale light filtered in, cold but honest. In that moment, he did not think about revenge. He thought about the night in the living room, the sound of shattering glass, the looks in his children's eyes when they asked why their father was not coming home. Marcus stood beside him, arms folded, his expression unchanged. As people began to rise from their seats, he leaned slightly toward Ethan and spoke quietly. "That is the end of his part." Ethan nodded, but he knew that for him, this was not the end. Maya was not there that day. She chose not to face the moment Grant was taken away, partly out of fear, partly out of shame. Grant's sentence was also a sentence for every choice she had once justified with ambition and fear of being left behind. In the small room where she was temporarily staying, Maya sat alone, staring at her dark phone screen, understanding for the first time what it meant to face silence with nowhere to hide. Victor was taken away not long after. He kept his head down, avoiding every gaze. The brutality that once made others fear him was now nothing more than a warped shadow. He had chosen to confess to save himself, and in return, he would spend the rest of his life paying the price of betraying both his boss and himself. Ethan left the courthouse after the rain had stopped. The road ahead was wet, reflecting endless lines of yellow streetlights. He walked slowly, each step firm. No one was chasing him anymore. No one was threatening him, but his heart was far from empty. The whistleblower group that Ethan and Marcus had quietly built began to show its real weight, not through sensational headlines, but through results. Another executive resigned. Another contract was cancelled. Another investigation was opened. People who once believed silence was the only way to survive began to speak. Ethan did not stand at the front. He stayed behind the scenes where the light was dimmer. He read every file, made every call, connected every person. The work brought no excitement. It was slow, heavy, and exhausting, but it was real. There were nights when Ethan came home late. The small apartment was quiet. Noah had grown used to leaving the hallway light on while waiting for his father. Ava and Mia slept soundly, their arms wrapped around their old stuffed animals. Ethan stood at their bedroom door for a long time, watching in silence, reminding himself why he was never allowed to turn back. One evening, as Ethan was clearing the dinner table, Noah asked, "Are the bad people all gone now?" "Dad." Ethan paused. He thought for a moment, then answered, "Bad people never disappear completely, but when enough people dare to tell the truth, they are no longer as powerful as they once were." Noah nodded, more serious than his age would suggest. Ava and Mia just laughed, not fully understanding, but feeling that this home was safer now. Marcus stopped by from time to time, no longer to discuss cases, just to share a small glass of wine and watch the children play. Once he said, "You know, real power is not making people afraid of you." Ethan looked at him. "Real power," Marcus continued, "is making them afraid to do the wrong thing, even when no one is watching." Ethan understood, and he knew this journey had changed him forever. He was no longer the man who only wanted a quiet life in the old house. He was not someone chasing fame either. He was a man who had looked straight into the darkness and chosen not to turn away. That night, Ethan stood by the window, the city peaceful below him. Grant was behind bars. A dark chapter had closed, but the book still had many pages left. Ethan took a deep breath. He did not know what challenges the future would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never again allow his story, or anyone else's, to be written by people who believed power gave them the right to trample others. And this time, he would not walk forward alone. The final door closed in silence, and only then did people realize that the man once dismissed as powerless had been standing in the position of decision all along. That morning the city woke as if nothing had happened. Traffic flowed. Coffee shops opened news, scrolled across cold, glowing screens. But for Ethan, everything had changed. He was no longer dragged by fear, no longer shrinking under doubtful stares. He stepped onto the small apartment balcony, drew a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, felt himself standing fully upright. Marcus called his voice low and concise. The council had just approved the complete dismantling of the remaining shadow structures. The shell companies were frozen, buried files brought into the light. No one would print Ethan's name in the papers, yet every decision carried his imprint, a kind of power that needed no display, only results. Ethan ended the call and turned back inside. The children were having breakfast. Noah looked up, his eyes calmer now. Ava and Mia argued over the last piece of bread, laughing. Ethan watched the scene, his heart softening, understanding that every battle was meaningless if he could not return to this place. A neighbor knocked a misdelivered letter. In that ordinary moment, Ethan realized the greatest twist had never been in the courtroom or the heavy sentences, but in the truth that the man once underestimated had never been weak. He had simply chosen silence when necessary, and action when the evidence was enough. That afternoon, Ethan attended another closed meeting. This time, there were no tense faces, only people who had once been afraid, and now dared to look straight ahead. A woman stood up, her hands shaking, but her voice steady, saying that without him, she would have given up. Ethan shook his head. "No, he said you stood up because of yourself. I only reminded you that the truth still has a path. As the sun set, Ethan left the building, streetlights stretching his shadow across the sidewalk. Someone recognized him, whispered his name like a question. Ethan did not stop. He did not need validation. He already knew who he was. Night fell, and the city quieted. Ethan sat by the window, thinking of the road behind him, from a man framed and cornered to someone holding the key to doors opened at the right moment. He understood that if there was anything to be proud of, it was not defeating others, but resisting the temptation of silence. Maya sent a short message, wishing the children well. Ethan did not reply immediately. Some chapters close on their own when people stop holding on. Before bed, Noah asked if his father still had to fight. Ethan smiled and ruffled his son's hair. Not fight, he said, just stand on the right side. When enough people do that, the darkness retreats on its own. In the dark room, Ethan lay still, listening to his children's steady breathing. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he would not turn away from the truth, would not compromise with fear, would not trade his conscience for false peace. Ethan's story did not end with applause. It ended with continuation, with ordinary mornings, small but right decisions, and a quiet promise that true power does not come from making others bow, but from helping them stand. If you stayed with this story until now, leave a comment about a time you were underestimated, but did not give up. Like if you believe the truth always carries its own weight, and subscribe so you do not miss the next stories about ordinary people who choose to step into the light. Because sometimes the most inspiring thing is not victory, but choosing the right side when no one is watching.